And with this prayer that Chuck often starts with when he preaches. I pray that every word I speak this morning be Spirit-led, and if not Spirit-led, then not heard, and if heard, then forgotten, and if not forgotten, then forgiven. And I want to add, if I ramble too long, I pray that you will be patient, that it will be meaningful to you, or that you will signal me to just shut up, please. I have been thinking a lot about family history in the past month. In particular, I've been thinking about the weirdest story I know of in my own family history. My grandfather, Henry, was the youngest of 5 children of Wilhelm and Teresa. But he usually told people he was the youngest of 8 because he knew his mother Teresa had been married before and had 3 children with her first husband, so he said he was the youngest of 8. Well, he later found out sometime in his adult life when someone did some genealogy that his father also had been married before and had 3 children. He never even knew, so he was actually the youngest of 11. Now, that seems a little strange, but the weirdest detail is Teresa's first husband, Johann, was Wilhelm's twin brother. So Teresa was married to Johann. He died. Story in the family goes that maybe Johann asked Wilhelm to look after Teresa. We're not really sure. But anyway, about a year later, she marries his twin brother. So my grandfather's older half-siblings were also his first cousins. Anyway. There you go, family. Well, the Gospel of Matthew begins with a genealogy, which is a list of names. Joanna Hereder, the author of our focus book for this season, writes, "This genealogy insists that Jesus has parents and grandparents and great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents." Now, as with most biblical genealogies, the list in Matthew is mostly the men, the fathers and sons. But this gospel writer has included 5 women in the record. And our book and our focus for this season of Advent is to look at these stories. Not because the women are more important but because their stories are human stories and a part of this bigger narrative of God's promise. As Hereder writes in the introductory devotion today, the story of Jesus' birth is grounded in human history, generation after generation of people living in this world, muddling through relationships, trying to find their way to God. Every name is a story with their own lives, their own loves, their own struggles and accomplishments. And so over these weeks of Advent, I look forward with you to seeing how the stories of these women, Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, Bathsheba, and Mary, connect to the Jesus story, the story of God with us, and our own stories. Okay, Micah, we can switch over. I attempted to create a PowerPoint, which was not in the right format, so hopefully this will help those of you who are more visually oriented to follow along with my message. So the Gospel of Matthew begins with this genealogy, a record of the ancestors of Jesus Christ, son of David, son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac. Isaac was the father of Jacob. Jacob was the father of Judah and his brothers. Judah was the father of Peretz and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. Tamar is the first woman named, and her story is recorded in Genesis 38, which, as we heard, begins with Judah moving away from his brothers and his family and settling amongst the Canaanites. But I want to set this in context a little bit. See, just 3 generations back from our story today, Abraham was called by God to leave his home and his family with promises that he would get land and many, many offspring. And God said, "I will bless you so that you will be a blessing. All the families on the earth will be blessed in you." Now, as you may know, this didn't exactly go very smoothly. Abraham and Sarah had no children, and they were very advanced in age. So Abraham fathers a son with his slave Hagar. But later, when Sarah's son, Isaac, was born, Hagar and Ishmael get banished. Now, Abraham ensures that his son will not marry a Canaanite woman. So Isaac and his cousin, Rebekah, have twin sons, Esau and Jacob. Now, Rebekah favors Jacob, Isaac favors Esau. The parents each pick favorites. Rebekah plots with Jacob to lie and deceive, trick Isaac, and steal Esau's blessing and birthright as the eldest. He gets cut off. After this, Isaac tells Jacob not to marry a Canaanite woman and sends him home to his uncle to find a wife. And there, Rebekah's brother Laban tricks Jacob into marrying the elder daughter, Leah, when Jacob really prefers the younger daughter, Rachel, so he ends up marrying them both. Now, there's a bunch of kids. There's also some concubines in there. We don't need to get into all those details. But anyway, there's all these sons, but Jacob plays favorites again. He prefers Joseph, Rachel's son. And so these sons of Jacob, I think it's really only 11 of them at that point. The 10 of them who are kind of listed on the left, and Joseph. The other 10 plot against Joseph. At first they think they're going to kill him. Judah is the one who suggests that instead of killing him, let's sell him to the traders. So they do. They cover it up. They lie to their father. And Jacob refuses to be comforted from this loss of his favorite son. This is where we are now. And so, Judah moves away from his brothers, from his distraught father, away from God's chosen family, and he's surrounded by outsiders. Further distancing himself from family tradition, he sees and marries, the Bible tells it that quickly, he sees and marries a Canaanite woman. Now, he fathers 3 sons. And then he chooses Tamar as the wife for his oldest son, Er. Now, Er is somehow wicked or immoral in the eyes of God. We don't know any more details than that. He dies as a consequence. The custom in this culture, which is so dependent on this lineage from the eldest son to the eldest son to the eldest son to the eldest son, is that the husband's brother, if there is one, has a duty to produce sons who will be the heirs of his dead brother. Not his own sons, but the heirs of his dead brother. Now, this is a conflict of interest. This second son is now set up to inherit the double portion. If he produces heirs for his older brother, that extra inheritance goes away for himself. And Onan knows this. He understands this is a conflict of interest. But it seems neither he nor Tamar have a choice. So, as a childless widow, she is at the mercy of her father-in-law for any sense of protection or security. And Onan would face humiliation and shame for himself and his family if he refuses this duty. So he doesn't actually refuse outright to participate. He agrees to share her bed and to use her, but he's deceiving his father-in-law and everyone around. He prevents fathering a child, and so he too dies as a consequence of these choices. Now there is a third brother, as yet too young to fulfill this duty of producing heirs. And Judah, the Bible tells us, is afraid of losing his only remaining child. Tamar is still bound to this family, but apparently Judah really doesn't want her around. So he sends Tamar to her father's home as a widow, he says, until Shelah grows up. He does not free her to be her father's daughter and thus be allowed to marry again, but he's just not really going to provide food and room and board right now. We have no idea what Tamar was thinking or feeling at any point in this story. So far, she's been the object of the actions, not the subject. Judah took her as a wife for heir, then he sent Onan to fulfill his obligation to his brother, and then he essentially orders her away. He disregards her well-being and basically rejects her personhood. And so Tamar is dressed in widow's garments. We know neither the depth of her feelings, is it grief or relief at the deaths of these 2 men, nor at the prospect of waiting for the third. She is in limbo, waiting on the sidelines at Judah's pleasure. Time passes as Tamar waits. Shelah, the third son, has grown up, but Judah has neither sent him to Tamar nor sent for Tamar to return. And Judah's wife dies. He mourns for a time, at least as what is ritually required, and then he sets out on the family's ranching business. And now Tamar takes action. She calculates risks and weighs her knowledge of the situation. She dresses and places herself to attract Judah's attention. What does Tamar know about Judah, about his character and his habits, that would make her think that this plan has even a modicum of success? What does she know about him? Think about that. She hears he's coming to shear sheep, and she thinks, I'm going to put on a veil and sit by the roadside. I've got a plan. So she wears a veil. Judah comes along. He sees her, but he doesn't recognize her, even when she speaks to him. They have engaged in dialogue. She's been the daughter-in-law in his tent, in his household, for who knows how long with these two sons. Even when she speaks to him, he does not recognize this woman. She obviously trusted that she had been an object, and mostly an object of a sexual nature, to this entire family. They have not given her attention as a person. Judah propositions, and Tamar negotiates. There. She negotiates to gain possession of his signet, cord, and staff. Now, the signet was a seal that was used to seal and to authenticate documents. It would have some kind of symbol on it which would specifically identify Judah. The cord could be something that was attached to the seal so that he could wear it like a necklace or around his wrist or carry it somehow, or it might be some kind of tasseled garment like a belt, but somehow it also was identifying him and showing his status and power in the community, along with this staff, which might have been carved and perhaps even carved by him, by his own hands. So one author that I read said that these items together are equivalent to Judah's credit rating, his identity papers, and his power of attorney all rolled into one. Why does this guy hand these over to a mysterious prostitute? I don't get it, but he's very ready to do so. I don't know if he has abandoned his family territory and his family traditions, and now even his name doesn't mean anything to him, or if he's just blinded by lust, or if he's just an extremely trusting person. But anyway, he just basically hands over everything to this woman. Tamar also seems to know something else. She knows herself. She seems to know that she is in the fertile time of her cycle, because this one encounter with Judah leads to pregnancy. Joanna Herder points out and calls this a masterful plan. A little time goes by. This pregnancy becomes public, and it's reported to Judah. Now, at this point, Judah's misogynism really kicks into high gear. His double standards are very clear. He didn't hesitate to solicit a prostitute on the side of the road, but at the mention of prostitution in connection with Tamar, he immediately demands the death penalty. Take her out and burn her, he says. And her careful planning saves her. She reveals this evidence of his identity. And seeing the signet, the cord, and the staff, Judah doesn't try to lie or hide. Surprisingly, amazingly to me, Judah sees the error of his ways. He is the one in power, and yet he confesses his actions, he admits his inappropriate motivations, and he turns away from his punishment. Judah declares, "She is more righteous than I am." What in the world does it mean for Tamar in this crazy story to be called righteous? Clearly, at least I don't think this story is promoting prostitution. Not that that's exactly what she was doing. Now, there is apparently, I just touched the surface in my research about this disagreement among scholars about the meaning of this word righteousness in the Hebrew Scriptures. Some argue that it is a very narrowly defined moral or religious or legal word, that you meet certain standards. Now, others are arguing that, at least in some instances, this word righteousness is describing actions which promote vitality and health within specific relationships. Actions which promote vitality and health within specific relationships. Now, we don't know if Tamar was aware of any of this family's history. We don't actually know how much Judah knew about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, let alone about Hagar, Ishmael, and Esau. But we can see that 4 generations of favoritism and rivalry, rejection, and deception have already traumatized and corrupted God's people. This set of family relationships into which Tamar has been brought is riddled with dysfunction and death. Now, it was obvious in the case of the wickedness and the destruction of Er and Onan, but of course it can also be felt in Judah's empty promise, driven by his fear and his refusal to see and care for Tamar. What grief is weighing Judah down after the loss of 2 sons and his wife? How much fear was he feeling for Shelah? And why did Judah leave his family anyway? Was he driven by guilt over his plotting against Joseph and his lies to his father? Anyway, in all of this, Judah has cut himself off in a way from the God of his ancestors and the bold promises to his family. And as one author said it, Judah's actions have actually placed his future into Tamar's hands. And that is a circumstance to which she responds with utterly determined resolve. Tamar is committed to this family and to caring for herself. Within the structure that ties her to Judah's family, she asserts her own rights and takes action. She demands, even through sort of deceptive means, that Judah meets his obligations and fulfill his promises to her that she should have a child and carry on this family. And Tamar gives birth to twins, and they become ancestors to King David and to Jesus. How does Tamar's story expect Emmanuel? Tamar's actions brought life and showed that God was with her in the midst of dysfunction and seeming dead ends. Through her plot and her pregnancy, God provided a future for the family and the community. And they set the stage for these other outsider women that we'll hear about in the weeks to come. And 2, in the scriptures we read really no more about Tamar, but we see that Judah seems to be transformed by this event. Later, in Genesis chapter 44, he is the one who will act to save his half-brother Benjamin, Joseph's full brother, from being imprisoned, and this brings about reconciliation with Joseph in Egypt. We remember that Jesus told the Pharisees and the scribes, the law was given to meet people's needs and to bring them good, not merely as requirements for to test people's obedience. Jesus broke the rules and offered healing on the Sabbath. Jesus broke the rules when he chose who his companions were. Like Jesus, who risked himself in breaking the rules to bring healing and justice, Tamar puts herself at risk of death in her attempt to bring life. She did not act with coercion. Her actions were driven by some sort of vision for the future, even if it was desperation, a desperate vision to change her circumstances and get unstuck from this life of a childless widow forever in waiting. Even so, she seemed to trust that it was worth the risk. Recently, a friend shared this definition of hope. Hope is the absolute conviction that despair will not have the last word. I think Tamar acted with hope. And in doing so, she gained a place in the family of God and in the lineage of the Messiah. Now, Jesus came to invite all of us into the kingdom, into relationship together as siblings and co-heirs of God's promises. We have joined the family through which God wants to bring blessing to all the world. In their book, Flawed Families of the Bible, David and Diana Garland write, "The fulfillment of God's promises comes through weak, scarred, scared, struggling, failing people who have suffered and survived." In Tamar's story, as I pondered it in connection to this Advent season, I hear an invitation for us. There are times of waiting. Sometimes we must trust and practice patience. And in these times, we have the promise of Isaiah chapter 40 that we heard when our candle was lit this morning. God will renew our strength. In those times, growth and learning can happen when we're in between and waiting. Sometimes, however, we are called to action. We are moved. If we recognize that we have set aside our own power or our autonomy has been denied by others, if we are stuck in untenable positions, how are we called to have hope, to gather our resources and stop waiting? For what is God renewing our strength? Because surely there are times when we need to be strong, when we need to run or to take flight. So as we count these days toward Christmas, looking to the birth of Jesus, the coming of blessing and new life, let us each discern carefully as individuals, and let us discern carefully as a family, as a group, as a church, when we are to wait and how we support those who wait, and when we are to act, to take risks, to reach out in hope. And may God bless us as we do so. Amen.